What happens when a Western leader stops playing nice with Trump's annexation threats? France just gave Canada the blueprint, and Washington's response reveals exactly why Ottawa needs to pay attention right now. Breaking tonight, the playbook for resisting Trump just got written in Paris. Emmanuel Macron didn't negotiate, he confronted. And what happened next shows Canada exactly what standing firm against American expansionism looks like in 2026. Tensions exploded across the Atlantic this week. Trump demanded Greenland from Denmark, threatened Europe with tariffs, and expected silence from allies. Instead of diplomatic compliance, Macron sent a private message questioning the entire Greenland strategy. Everyone believed European leaders would accommodate Trump's territorial ambitions quietly. Analysts expected cautious, behind-the-scenes negotiation. Financial markets assumed allies would avoid public confrontation with Washington. They were all utterly wrong. Paris, January 20th, 2026. Donald Trump, standing at his Truth Social account, made a decision that shattered Western diplomatic norms. He leaked Emmanuel Macron's private message to the world, a confidential text from one allied leader to another, published for maximum humiliation. Translation: Trump just showed every ally, including Canada, that private diplomacy means nothing when you challenge his territorial fantasies. And Macron's response? He didn't apologize. He didn't backtrack. He flew to Davos and said 5 words that every Canadian should memorize. We prefer respect to bullies. Dear viewers, between January 18th and January 20th, 2026, something extraordinary happened in Western alliance relationships. Trump pushed for Greenland. Macron said no privately. Trump weaponized that privacy publicly. And France, dignified, resolute France, became the ally that showed Canada exactly how sovereignty defense works when Washington turns hostile. This isn't just about Greenland. This is about the fundamental collapse of American alliance management and the rise of European defiance as the new template for Canadian strategy. Let's understand what actually happened here. Trump wants Greenland, not for negotiation, for seizure. He's threatened Denmark with economic punishment, posted maps showing Greenland as American territory, and demanded what he calls national security justification. But Greenland is sovereign Danish territory, protected by NATO Article 5. Trump doesn't care. He sees proximity as weakness, alliance as leverage, and sovereignty as negotiable. Sound familiar, Canada? Trump has threatened to make Canada the 51st state. He's posted maps showing the Canadian flag replaced by American stars and stripes. He's suggested economic coercion to force annexation. The pattern is identical: threaten allies, demand territory, expect compliance. Macron watched this strategy unfold and made a calculation. He could stay silent and hope Canada and Denmark absorb Trump's aggression alone. Or he could build a coalition and confront the threat directly. He chose confrontation. In his private message to Trump, reviewed by Le Monde, Macron wrote clearly, "I do not understand what you are doing on Greenland." Then he proposed something Trump never expected, a G7 summit in Paris on January 23rd, not to accommodate American demands, but to coordinate Allied resistance. Macron suggested inviting Ukraine to the meeting, Denmark to discuss Greenland directly, Syria to address Middle East strategy, and Russia, on the margins, to explore diplomatic alternatives Trump has ignored. Translation: Macron just told Trump that European leaders will organize their own strategic agenda, with or without American approval. Trump's response revealed everything about how he handles Allied pushback. He didn't engage diplomatically. He didn't negotiate privately. He leaked Macron's confidential message to humiliate France publicly, then threatened 200% tariffs on French wine. This is the Trump doctrine in action. Challenge American territorial ambitions, face economic punishment. Propose alternative diplomatic frameworks, get your private communications weaponized against you. Maintain European sovereignty, watch traditional alliance norms collapse. But here's what Trump didn't anticipate. Macron didn't fold. At Davos on January 20th, with global media watching, Macron delivered a speech that every Canadian policymaker should study word for word. He opened with deliberate irony. It's a time of peace, stability, and predictability. The audience laughed because everyone knows that's precisely what 2026 is not. Then Macron got specific. It's not a time for new imperialism or new colonialism, he said, staring directly at the cameras broadcasting to Washington. This is a time of cooperation. And the finale, we do prefer respect to bullies, and we do prefer rule of law to brutality. No ambiguity, no diplomatic softening, no pretending Trump's territorial threats are normal negotiation tactics. Macron called American expansionism exactly what it is, bullying backed by brutality. The French president didn't stop there. He told Europe directly, Europe should not hesitate to deploy tools at its disposal to protect its interests. Translation: if Trump wants a trade war over sovereignty, Europe will fight back economically. Now, why does this matter desperately for Canada? Because Canada faces the exact same threats Macron just confronted, and Ottawa's response has been dramatically different. Trump posts maps showing Canada as American territory. Mark Carney hasn't made a Davos speech calling it colonialism. Trump threatens to make Canada the 51st state. Canadian officials issue careful diplomatic statements instead of blunt confrontations. Trump suggests economic coercion to force annexation. Ottawa responds with reassurances about bilateral cooperation. Macron just demonstrated that there's another option: public defiance backed by coalition building. Think about the strategic landscape Canada navigates right now. Trump wants Canadian territory and resources. He's threatening tariffs if Ottawa doesn't comply with American demands. He's posted propaganda showing the Canadian flag erased by American symbols. He suggested military force isn't off the table for territorial acquisition. Every single threat Macron faced with Greenland, Canada faces domestically. But France has 67 million people and nuclear weapons. Canada has 41 million people and relies on American security guarantees through NATO. That asymmetry makes Macron's strategy even more relevant for Ottawa. Because Macron didn't confront Trump alone, he proposed a G7 summit, a coalition framework. He invited Denmark, the direct Greenland target, to participate. He suggested Ukraine, showing support for sovereignty under threat. He even proposed Russia on the margins, demonstrating diplomatic flexibility Trump lacks. This is coalition sovereignty defense, not isolated resistance. And it's exactly what Canada needs to adopt immediately. Here's the pattern every Canadian should recognize. Trump targets allies who appear isolated. Denmark, with 6 million people, seemed vulnerable alone. But Macron did something clever. He turned Greenland into Europe's problem, not just Denmark's headache. Now Trump isn't bullying a small Nordic ally anymore. He's facing down the entire EU. Canada, we could do exactly that tomorrow. When Trump threatens Canadian sovereignty, here's what Ottawa should not do. Sit down for a quiet bilateral chat with Washington. That's the old playbook, and it doesn't work anymore. Instead, get on the phone with London, Canberra, Wellington, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo. Every democracy that still believes borders matter and territorial conquest isn't acceptable policy. Turn Canadian sovereignty into something the entire democratic world has to defend. Stop treating this like it's just between us and Washington. Macron demonstrated exactly how this works. When Trump leaked his private message, Macron didn't retreat into diplomatic silence. He escalated to public confrontation at Davos, knowing global media would amplify his message. He forced the world to choose between respecting sovereignty and accepting American expansionism. Canada needs that same willingness to escalate rhetorically when Trump crosses red lines. Macron understood that Trump respects strength and exploits weakness. So Macron demonstrated strength, knowing it would trigger retaliation, calculating that retaliation is preferable to capitulation. Canada needs to internalize that same calculation. Look at how Ottawa has responded to Trump's 51st state rhetoric. Carefully worded statements about Canadian sovereignty, diplomatic reassurances about bilateral friendship, all perfectly reasonable, all completely ineffective. Because Trump isn't making a serious constitutional argument. He's testing whether Canada will publicly confront American expansionism or politely deflect it. Macron showed what confrontation looks like, calling it colonialism, calling it bullying, calling it brutality. Imagine Mark Carney as Prime Minister standing at an international forum and saying, Canada does not negotiate sovereignty with nations that threaten annexation. We prefer respect to bullies, and we prefer rule of law to territorial conquest. That's the Macron playbook applied to Canadian circumstances. It requires rhetorical clarity about what Canada will and won't accept from Washington. And here's why that clarity matters strategically. Trump operates through intimidation and escalation. He makes outrageous demands, expecting targets to offer compromises that still advance American interests. Macron made Greenland a red line sovereignty issue, removing any middle ground for compromise. Canada needs that same red line clarity. Canadian territory isn't negotiable. Canadian sovereignty isn't negotiable. The right to make independent foreign policy decisions is unnegotiable. Once Ottawa establishes those red lines publicly, Trump's room for intimidation shrinks dramatically. But establishing red lines requires willingness to accept consequences. Macron knew Trump would retaliate for confrontation. The 200% wine tariff threat was entirely predictable. But Macron calculated that French sovereignty is worth more than temporary trade friction. Canada faces the exact same calculation. If Trump threatens tariffs over Canadian sovereignty defense, does Ottawa capitulate or escalate? Macron's answer was escalate rhetorically while preparing economic countermeasures. Europe has tools, he said at Davos, and Europe won't hesitate to deploy them. Canada has tools too: retaliatory tariffs, energy export restrictions, critical mineral export controls, security cooperation limitations. None of these options are cost-free, but neither is accepting American territorial threats without resistance. The question is whether Canadian leadership has the political will to deploy those tools if Trump escalates from rhetoric to action. And this brings us to the fundamental strategic choice Canada faces in 2026. Macron chose public confrontation backed by coalition building, and his choice reveals exactly what sovereignty defense requires when facing adversarial American leadership: clarity, coalition, and consequences. Clarity about what's acceptable and what isn't. Coalition with other democracies facing similar threats. Consequences for crossing red lines, even if those consequences carry costs. Canada hasn't demonstrated any of those three elements yet, but the Greenland crisis just provided the perfect template for how to start. Dear viewers, this is the moment where Canada decides what kind of nation it will be under American pressure. A nation that accommodates territorial threats with diplomatic language, or a nation that confronts expansionism with the same defiance Macron just demonstrated. The choice matters because Trump is watching how allies respond. Denmark's reaction, France's reaction, Canada's reaction, all of it informs Trump's calculation about how far he can push territorial demands. If Canada stays silent while Macron confronts, Trump learns that Ottawa is the easier target. If Canada joins European resistance publicly, Trump learns that sovereignty threats trigger coalition responses, not isolated capitulation. We've seen this pattern before, and in 2018, when Trump first threatened European allies, those who responded forcefully faced short-term friction but maintained long-term respect. Those who accommodated quietly faced escalating demands. Canada has the choice right now to learn from that history instead of repeating it. And here's what learning from Macron's playbook would look like practically. First, public rhetorical escalation. The next time Trump posts a map showing Canada as American territory, the Prime Minister goes on camera and says, "Canada rejects American expansionism categorically. We prefer respect to bullies." Second, coalition coordination. Ottawa proposes a sovereignty defense framework with Denmark, European capitals, and Indo-Pacific democracies. Make territorial threats against any member a concern for all members. Third, economic preparedness. Canada announces contingency plans for Trump's tariffs, retaliatory measures ready to deploy, alternative trade partnerships ready to activate. None of this requires Canada to initiate conflict, but all of it demonstrates that sovereignty defense is non-negotiable and accommodation has limits. Macron understood that Trump respects strength and exploits weakness, so Macron demonstrated strength, knowing it would trigger retaliation, calculating that retaliation is preferable to capitulation. Canada needs to internalize that same calculation, because the alternative, quiet diplomacy and bilateral accommodation, has already failed to deter Trump's 51st state rhetoric. It hasn't stopped the propaganda maps. It hasn't prevented the annexation suggestions. Traditional diplomacy assumes good faith partners. Trump isn't operating in good faith on sovereignty questions. Macron recognized that reality and adjusted accordingly. Canada needs to follow. So here's what 2026 comes down to for Canada. This isn't about whether we can avoid making Trump angry. We can't. He's already threatening our territory. The real question is whether Canada will stand up the way France just did, with that same brutal clarity, or whether we'll stay quiet because we're scared of what happens next. Macron chose defiance. Trump chose retaliation. Macron doubled down at Davos. And now the world knows exactly where France stands on American expansionism. Firmly opposed, publicly committed, strategically coordinated with allies. Canada could send that same message tomorrow. The question is whether political courage exists to say what needs saying, that Canadian sovereignty is not negotiable, not even with the United States. If you believe Canada deserves leadership willing to confront American expansionism the way Macron just confronted it, this channel is tracking every development in Ottawa's strategic response. We're not here for diplomatic niceties. We're here for sovereignty defense. The world just watched France show Canada the playbook. Now we'll see if Canada has the will to use it